We'll be starting. And good afternoon, as we're starting the World Oregon webinar this afternoon. Thanks to all of us who are joining this day, either from the Portland metro area, across Oregon, or throughout the United States and the world. We're thrilled to have Ian Johnson speaking to us here shortly. I will be passing the baton to my colleague, Tim DeRoche, in a couple minutes. He's our director of programs, who will introduce our speaker and help moderate questions. Again, today's event is a speaker program webinar. If you haven't been in one of those in a while from us, a reminder that we ask you to please post your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. In the chat, we will post links to things that may be of interest to you. For instance, we're excited about a program we have upcoming later this month about U.S. diplomacy. I'm posting the link on the chat. It's called Navigating Next, Blueprints for 21st Century Diplomacy with Ambassador Joe Allen Powell. This is after Thanksgiving. It's November 28th in the evening. And I encourage you to register. It's a free program, but registration is required. It's in person. And so because it's in person, we just need to get folks' names and things. So I encourage you to join us. We'll have a lot of former and current diplomats in the audience, which should be a fun and interesting discussion. Again, that's November 28th. There's the link in the chat. Should be a fascinating discussion in person at our offices that we are next to the Oregon Historical Society. Again, this World Oregon webinar is open to everyone, although we encourage you to become a member of World Oregon. Membership in World Oregon helps support our work, and I'm posting a link to that in the chat. We try to make as many of these events possible free to the general public, but membership helps support these efforts. We'll be posting this later on YouTube, so mind your P's and Q's, please, in the questions. And please try to keep your questions germane to the author's expertise. Also, just wanted to draw your attention to our recent e-newsletter. We have a lot of good information that Tim has shared about some of the other programs we have upcoming. I will post some of those in the chat. In fact, he's moderating a discussion. Should be very interesting at the QDoc Documentary Film Festival, a film called Transition. Fascinating story. I will post that in the chat. That is Friday night. And we have a discount code for folks in the World Oregon community. So look for information in the chat. Without further ado, I am going to pass it over to Tim, who's going to introduce our speaker as we look into a fascinating discussion about China. And we thank all of those who are supporters of Northwest China Council who are joining us today as they helped spread the word about this event. Tim.
Great. Thanks, Derek. Really, really excited to have you all here today as we with the blurred thing of Zoom, it's hard to see, but Sparks is a fantastic book by Ian Johnson, and I'm really glad that he could join us here today. The subtitle of Sparks is China's Underground Historians and Their Battle for the Future. Ian Johnson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer who has spent 20 years in China, up until, I believe, March 2020, writing for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, as well as serving for 5 years on the editorial board of the Journal of Asian Studies. He is the author of 3 other books that focus on the intersection of politics and society, including The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao, and Wild Grass, 3 Stories of Change in Modern China. He is the senior fellow for China at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we are really glad that you could join us today. Ian, the floor is yours. I will see you where you will hear me when I come back in for the Q&A. For you in the audience, as to reiterate what Derek said, put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, and hopefully we will have some wonderful back and forth. Okay, it's all yours, Ian.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to join you on this webinar. I'm going to be out in on the West Coast in Seattle. In fact, for those of you in Seattle in March, where the Association of Asian Studies has its big annual meeting. which will be quite interesting for those of you who are into Asian studies or interested in these topics. There are a lot of interesting panels that happen that weekend. I think that's the 14th, 15th, 16th of March of next year. I'll be talking a bit about my book, but I also was just back in China. I lived there for 20 years, off and on since the 1980s, and mainly as a journalist, as a correspondent, first as a student from 84, 85, and then I went back. I was with the Baltimore Sun and then the Wall Street Journal, where I covered macroeconomics, and China's joining the WTO about 20 years ago in a more optimistic time in Sino-US relations. Then I went back around the time of the Summer Olympics in 2008 and stayed until 2020, when I was expelled as part of these tit-for-tat journalistic expulsions. So I've looked at a lot of different trends and topics over the years. The last 10 years that I was in China, basically throughout the Xi Jinping era, through the 2010s, I began to focus less on daily journalism and on writing longer form journalism. As Tim mentioned, I was working at the Journal of Asian Studies, which is a big academic journal, advising them on how to make academic articles more accessible to the general public, working on a PhD and writing books, out of which two books stem from that period of my life. One was The Souls of China that he mentioned, which is a look at the spiritual side of the rise of China. We all know China is a huge economic power, rising power, military power, etc. But what do the people there really believe in? What motivates them? What is the thing that drives them beyond wanting to make money, which is sort of the stereotype that many people have of China, that it's just a pragmatic place where nothing matters except for do, re, mi. But actually, there's a big spiritual revival that's been going on in China for the past 20 years as people begin to wonder what's going on, what is there to life beyond my first BMW, and or having a secure job, or sending my kids to college and stuff like that. These are sort of universal themes that I worked on, as I said, in the 2010s, and then at the same time, starting about 2013, I began to work on my current book, which is about another spiritual but more of a political quest, which is to challenge the Communist Party's monopoly on history, which might sound like a sort of obscure topic or something that perhaps only of interest to historians or historiographers or something like that. But history is at the basis of how the Communist Party justifies its rule. It's almost simplistic to say, but it's important to just remember that the Communist Party can't justify why it rules China, except to say that history called it to save China. The reality is that the Communist Party won a civil war between 1945 and 1949. That's why it runs China. But that doesn't sound too good, to say that you defeated the government of China in a civil war and you had the more powerful army at that time, and that's why you're running the country and have been running it for nearly 75 years. You have to have something more stirring and something that gives you more legitimacy. And history is what the party uses. So in other words, the story that the party tells is that in the 19th century, China was laid low by foreign powers. You think of the Opium Wars and things like that, unequal treaties. China was being carved up into colonies. And that was what they often refer to as 100 years of humiliation from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. And it was only in 1949 when the Communist Party of China, the CCP, when it took power, that China was put back on its feet again and put on the road to prosperity, got its territorial integrity back, brought the United States to a standstill in the Korean War, developed atomic weapons, et cetera, became a true power again. And this is sort of a national myth. Now, there's elements of truth to that. In 1949, the CCP did give China back, or brought China's territorial integrity back to it, and it did put China on the road to prosperity. However, the past 75 years have also been full of many darker chapters that were not so feel good. such as the worst famine in recorded history, when up to 45 million people died. A campaign against people who used to run China, the literati, sort of educated people in the countryside in the early 1950s that claimed 1.5 million people. The Cultural Revolution, which many people may have heard of or be familiar with, from 66 to 76, when again over 1 million people were killed, and on, Tiananmen Square, et cetera, et cetera. Not so much in the past few decades, but still there have been many problems. But and so these are these chapters of the past that the party ignores, that it whitewashes, and says that not only did history bring us to power to save China, but history has deemed our rule to be so flawless, if you will, that we have to continue to rule China indefinitely. There can be no other party. Anything else other than this Communist Party would lead to chaos, and therefore the party must rule China. And this is what political scientists sometimes call performance legitimacy. You legitimize your rule by saying you're doing a great job. It's something that we have in democratic societies too, when a candidate is running for re-election. This is essentially what Joe Biden will say, or try to say, next year when he runs for re-election. He'll say, look, I did a great job over the previous 4 years, re-elect me. Except in China, there is no re-election and there are no term limits. So it's sort of this open-ended desire to project a perfect record. And that would include not just catastrophic events of the past century or something like that, like the Cultural Revolution, but even things like handling the COVID crackdown, which by some measures wasn't too bad in China, but did lead to many, many excess deaths and a lot of misery for many people. I would also have to include the fact that the economy is slowing down in China now, that you have 20% youth unemployment. These are all elements that are completely off the table in China. And the people I document in this book are trying to tell a different story. They have existed in China and many countries around the world, but focusing here on China, existed in China for decades. But I think in the West, we have tended to overlook them, especially in the Xi Jinping era. We tend to think that the past 10 years under Xi Jinping, it's been a little over 10 years now, it's been 11 years since he took over as general secretary of the Communist Party, that he has implemented a perfect dictatorship where the surveillance state, closed circuit television cameras, AI, you name it, has meant that the whole country is in a permanent state of lockdown and nobody can do or say anything. However, the message, maybe the somewhat counterintuitive message of my book, is that this is not true. There are many people in China who have different visions of the country's future. Some of them are inside the party, many of them are outside the party, and they're all challenging the party on this sacred, hallowed ground, which is that this is, and in other words, history. So they look at the catastrophes, the debacles of last century, but everything up into including the COVID policies of the past few years. So history I define broadly, being anything basically that happened as of yesterday. Some of it might be considered current history. Some of it is contemporary or modern history, but all of it is tightly controlled by the party. And all of it is used by these counter historians to challenge the party. Why do I focus on them now? Couldn't I have written this book 10 or 20 years ago? The answer is no, I couldn't have. And the reason is that this movement, although I mentioned there were people, say 50 years ago, who wrote about the failures of the Communist Party, it's really only in the past 20 years that this movement has taken off. And the reason why is due to basic digital technologies that we take completely for granted, but which have revolutionized the flow of information in China, and I think in many authoritarian states around the world today. Excuse me while I just take a sip of tea. I'm getting over a bad virus that I've had, RSV, and it's slightly made me still a little bit congested and stuff like that. Okay, so why 20 years ago? As I said, basic digital technologies, the most basic of which many of us hate, and that is a PDF. I don't know if you like to read the PDFs. Most of us don't like it. Most of us prefer something printed out or something like that. But PDFs began to become more popular in the late 1990s. The technology began to spread widely, also in China. And what this did was it put publishing in ordinary people's hands. And if I can give you an anecdote to explain that, the title of the book is called Sparks. And this is drawn from a magazine that was founded in 1960 in China by a group of students who had been exiled to the western part of the country as part of they were caught up in a political campaign. They were declared what's known as rightists. They were, and in any case, anti-communist party. They were exiled to this far reaches of China, and there they saw firsthand the Great Famine of 1959 to 1961, the one that I mentioned earlier that killed about 45 million people. The famine shocked them. They saw cannibalism. They saw the most horrible things happening due to the lack of food. And they decided to try to let people know about it. And they hit upon the somewhat quixotic effort of starting a journal. They had managed to get their hands on a mimeograph machine and thought that if they could just let officials know what was going on, officials would change their policies because they recognized it was a policy-driven famine. It wasn't due to droughts or any sort of natural disasters. It was due to sort of insane economic policies that the founding father of the People's Republic, Mao Zedong, that he had implemented. So they wrote up a series of essays against authoritarian rule, saying a lack of checks and balances, a lack of free speech, that farmers didn't own their land. All the land was owned by the state, and the farmers couldn't do what they wanted with their land. They couldn't plant what they wanted, etc. And that all of this had led to the famine. They printed it up and they mimeographed it, essentially made copies and mailed it out to party offices around China. There were about 40 people involved in this, 43 to be exact. Within a couple of months, the second issue of the magazine was still being printed. They were still running off copies of it when the Public Security Bureau zoomed in, as you can imagine. This is the high point of totalitarian control in China, arrested everybody. 3 people were executed. The other 40 people were sent to labor camps, some of them for up to 20 years. The magazine vanished. All of the copies were confiscated, and we would never have known anything about it. It would have been just one of the many innumerable efforts by people to protest one-party rule if it were not for digital technologies. So what happened was in the 1980s, many people in China, this was the end of the Cultural Revolution, Mao had died, the new regime was in power under Deng Xiaoping and his handpicked successors, and they said, okay, we're going to try to make amends for what had happened over the first 30 years of Communist Party rule. Some people were allowed to look into their personnel file and see what had happened to them, what the punishment had been, and the punishments were negated. They were wiped off the slate. This happened to one of the people who had been sent to labor camp. She was, at this point now, a woman in her 50s. She looked into her personnel file, and there was everything relating to the case, absolutely everything. All the copies of the magazine, the confessions of all 40 students, even the love letters that she had written to her boyfriend, who was one of the founders of the magazine, and he had been executed. All of this was in her file. She took photos of it and took it back home to Shanghai. And it would have just sat there and nobody would have known anything about it except for maybe a few friends, other people who have been persecuted, except 10 years later, we have PDFs and people say to her, hey, we can actually use these photos that you have and recreate the magazine. We can just make a PDF version of the magazine based on the photos. And that's exactly what they did. And this started this spread the story of Spark around China. China's best known independent documentary filmmaker, a fellow in Nanjing called Hu Jie, he made 2 absolutely dynamite films, which you can see on YouTube about this film, about this famine and the student journal. People began to write about it. It was incredibly powerful for many people in China who were contesting one-party rule to read about Spark because they realized that people were addressing the same issues a generation earlier that people were grappling with today. Don't forget, this is just 10 years after the founding of the Communist Party. They already had, of the, not the Communist Party, but of the People's Republic of China. And these students had already identified the crucial issues of lack of freedom of speech, lack of checks and balances, farmers not owning their land. These are all issues that apply absolutely today in 2023. The essays are extremely current and contemporary. One of the most prominent critics in Beijing, Sui Weiping, she said, now we have our genealogy. In other words, we know there were people who came before us looking at exactly the same issues. It's like a creation of a lineage of people who are standing up to one party rule. And it gave them an inspiration to know that people have been doing that. And Spark is just one example. At around the same time, many other famous essays and articles and books that had been written in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s began to be republished or made available by PDF and spread around China. And this was really the beginning of this counter-history movement. It's the creation of a collective memory among a certain class of Chinese, not the majority of Chinese, but among many well-informed people of everything that the CCP has done, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in a way that the party does not want. And this also started at the same time. I mentioned independent filmmakers such as this guy Hu Jie. Their films are only possible because of digital cameras, another digital technology that we take completely for granted. We have it in our phones, but small handheld cameras can make excellent films. You don't have to cut it on specialized equipment. You don't have to send the film off to be developed. You can just download it onto your laptop and cut a film. And since the late 1990s, especially since the early 2000s, there's been hundreds of independent films made in China that challenge the CCP's monopoly on history. And so all of this is spread. You may wonder, well, how important is this really? Is this just a group of a few dozen people or a few hundred people? To which I would say there's two ways to answer this. First of all, it's not just a small group of people. These are not dissidents. The reason I call them underground historians is because they're not just a few hundred people in Beijing and Shanghai and a couple of other big cities. They are thousands of people around China who are not in any formal organization, but who are sharing ideas and information by email, through memory drives, thumb drives, USB drives, and basic digital technologies like that. They share these books, they share the movies, and an understanding of the past has grown up over the past 20 years, let's say. So just to sort of maybe come to a close, the reason why this matters so much, I think, can also be seen by Xi Jinping himself. One of Xi Jinping's signature policies has been the control of history. Since he took power in 2012, his first public appearance then was at the National Museum of China in an exhibition which describes the party's saving of China. In 2013, he banned all criticism of the Mao era. In 2016, he closed down China's most important history journal, a journal that his own father had actually supported. And in 2021, he basically rewrote the history of China and passed a resolution that has become a guideline for how everybody in official China, from makers of exhibitions and movies and television series, and of course textbooks, history books, how they have to write and tell the past 100 years of history. So this shows, I think, the great importance that he attaches to it, that he feels this is a real threat. He's talked about it on numerous occasions, especially in relationship to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this movement, I think, is something that's often overlooked. It shows that there are people, even in today, even in this darkest period, in probably arguably the past half century, that there are people who are keeping the flame of independent thought alive in China, and that although their impact is hard to know in the near future, it's something that will continue to go forward, and there are people I think we ought to get to know the same way that we got to know people from Central and Eastern Europe during the Cold War. So with that, let me stop and see if maybe Tim has a couple of follow-up questions and open the floor to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. It's interesting as you've been talking about the underground historians, and I'll mangle the Chinese word. Is it Minjian Lishi? Is that the phrase?
Yeah, Minjian Lisher. Yeah, unofficial histories. Yeah.
You talk about them constituting a movement, and when I think about movements, my brain often goes to things like Tiananmen Square or Falun Gong or the Hong Kong protests, but this seems like a movement of a different sense, and so you do really, in fact, see this as a significant momentum and movement.
Yeah, I do. I think we can see that even as recently as last year. There were protests in China that are often dubbed the white paper protests because people just held up blank sheets of paper over their head. This isn't a blank sheet of paper, but anyways, they held up blank sheets of paper over their head because they couldn't say anything, right? And these protests spread to various cities around China. They were mainly young people who were upset with the COVID policies and also with, I think, the economy and other issues like that. They were drawing on many of the people that I write about. So when I wrote about these people and began following them 10 years ago, I didn't think that they would be actually at the center of a nationwide protest movement in the early 2020s. But that is, in fact, what happened. Many of the essays that they wrote became very popular. The book is focused on, there's a lot of people in the book, but there's two main characters, two important women who carry us from the beginning of the book to the end. One is the independent journalist Jiang Xue, and her writings went viral during the COVID lockdowns. Another is a feminist scholar and documentary filmmaker, Ai Xiaoming. Her works have also become very popular during this period. So I do think it's a loose movement. It's certainly, if there was anything organized, the Public Security Bureau would swoop in and crush it, just as it has many, many times in the past. But I think this is a broader yearning. We see the importance of history, not just in China, but even in our own countries, in the United States, the importance of history to current day debates. It's something in a lot of countries nowadays. Many people are challenging official versions of history in a way that wasn't really the case half a century or a century ago.
Well, it's interesting. I just returned from Central Europe, and I was in Budapest and Prague and Krakow, and cities that have very, deep, rich, and complicated histories. Yet they confront their histories in a very, very powerful way. And in terms of thinking about public and collective memory, I can't help but then turn this back on our own country and thinking about the backlash on teaching history, on teaching about race, the rise in book bans. What can the U.S. learn from China's grassroots historians?
Well, of course, the political systems are so different, but it does show that maybe government efforts, whether it's state or national, are often going to be challenged by people at the grassroots. I think the inspiring thing to me about the case in China is that these people face a lot of hurdles and they still keep at it because they believe fervently in the power of history. And history in China, I didn't get into this point, but history in China is one of the most powerful forces that people believe in. They believe that history ultimately comes down on the side of the good guy, that right defeats might. And this is a story, it's a universal idea, right? But this is something in Chinese history. The great heroes of Chinese history are the people who stood up to power. They stood up to the emperor, they stood up to the corrupt officials. And even if they were banished and tortured, exiled, in the end, they're the heroes of the story that all Chinese school children learn. So there's something empowering by the use of history that people in China feel. And that's why, even though they know they're fighting against incredible odds, they feel that in the long run, they're going to win, and that Xi Jinping and people like him have always lost. Maybe a romantic view of the past, but that's what they firmly believe in.
So in March 2020, you mentioned this, as COVID was careening across the globe, you were among a handful of journalists who were expelled. And, as you mentioned, you returned there recently, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what you saw and experienced, and maybe what stood out in a post-pandemic or at least an endemic landscape there.
Yeah, I went back in May for a few weeks. I said I'd lived in China for over 20 years. I had a lot of people to go back and talk to. I think there were, a couple things. One is that the people I write about in the book, and this is something people might ask about, did they give you your permission to mention their names, etc. They all had given their permission, and I went back and talked to them all, and many of them, in fact, they're all still working on various projects, movies, books, underground publications, etc. That's the heartening thing. The less heartening thing is that the government has used COVID as an excuse to kind of reset its contacts to the outside world. People might be shocked to know that right now in China, there are only about 350 US students, period. That's undergraduate and graduate. There are only about 350 people in China studying Chinese. There used to be tens of thousands, and there's literally 1,000 times that, or about 1,000 times, about 250, 275,000 Chinese students in the United States. China, many people, of course, had to leave China because of COVID, but some of the great academic programs that we'd used to send scholars over to China have been cut from our side. In fact, at the end of the Trump administration, killing the Fulbright program, the Peace Corps program, etc. But there's been no effort been made to really restart this. I don't think China wants to have the same level of foreigners back there. I lived the whole time, my whole 20 years, basically in Beijing. And in Beijing, being a foreigner for most of the time was unremarkable. Nobody looked at you, oh, a foreigner, unless they were just in from the countryside or something like that. But this time, going back, people were kind of doing swivel heads, like, oh, a foreigner? Wow, I haven't seen a foreigner here in a long time. And especially when I left Beijing, went to other places, people were welcoming, but they were like, gosh, where's everybody gone? Where have all the foreigners gone? And I feel like China's never been more cut off than in the 40 years that I've been going to China. And this is a self-imposed cutoff. It's got all of, as we know, there's a firewall that cuts off people inside China from the outside internet, that many sites are censored. But when you go back after being away for a while, you realize just how complete this is, that the apps, everything that people use are completely different from the things we use. So getting around China is also, it is just a superficial observation, but it's cumbersome because you need to have Chinese apps, you have to have a Chinese cell phone number, otherwise nothing works. But it's also, people there have a hard time accessing the outside world. Censorship has never been stronger, and many people are frustrated, especially people who had kind of bought into the whole 40 years of reform and opening. They thought China was going to get more and more open. They didn't think that one day the government was going to turn its back on this recipe for success that it's had throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the first part of the 2010s, and now kind of go back to this era, which I think is more cut off and less optimistic among the Chinese people I spoke to than at any time since I've been going there.
Well, it's interesting. It's almost like you read my mind. I actually had a question about the diplomatic speed bumps that we experienced over the last handful of years, which included ceasing Peace Corps and Fulbright programs, and pretty much a wholesale shuttering in this country of Confucius institutes, and whether you see any commitment from the U.S. angle to restart these programs.
No, I don't see this being high on the agenda of the Biden administration. Many people at first, when we saw the policies under Trump, many people thought, well, this is Trump being a populist, et cetera. He came to power mainly focused on things like the trade deficit. And then when he didn't get anywhere with the trade deficit with China, had this big deal, but didn't really do anything. He turned his attention, especially in the last year of his administration, to closing down many of the people-to-people contacts and so on, under the rubric of this is helping China more than it's helping the United States, which is completely inaccurate in my view. But when Biden took over, I think many people, myself included, thought he might try to restart things like the Fulbright program, which is absolutely important. I don't think China would have wanted to or would want to restart this program, because who wants to have U.S. PhD students traipsing around the hill tribes of Yunnan province, poking into villages? But that's exactly what the Fulbright did for US scholars. It funded grassroots research so we got a better idea of really what's going on the ground. I think there's a delusion among many people in the world today, not just about China, but about the whole world, that we can learn everything we need to know in front of a computer, right? That we can watch YouTube videos of somebody, we can watch various things, and that's reality. But in fact, if you really want to know a place, you have to go there and you have to experience it firsthand. You can learn a lot off the internet. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do a lot of research virtually and through various tools that have also transformed journalism and scholarship, etc. But to test drive these hypotheses, you have to be there. There's no excuse for boots on the ground. And that's true in military parlance, but it's also true in how we understand the outside world. So we have to, and part of it is also stuff like the State Department has a level 3 travel warning on China. So that means many universities in the United States have almost a fiduciary duty that they are not allowed to send students to countries that have level 3 travel warnings. Now, level 3 travel warning implies that you could be kidnapped or shot or something. China is not that dangerous of a place. This is almost weaponizing, I think, this travel warning, just to sort of show that China is a really bad, dangerous place, when in fact it's not really like that. I mean, it's got its problems. There are challenges for people in certain areas and certain professions, but for students and people like that, I think there's almost zero risk. But I think the administration has made a mistake by also not. Some of the things I totally am on board with, such as limiting the sale of semiconductors, but I think it should also be a broader vision of how we deal with China for the rest of the century. Not just how to limit our exposure to China, but how we actually engage on some level with China, because we have to deal with it. It's there. It's a reality. We have to understand it.
A lot of higher education folks will cite things like gun violence and rising anti-Asian racism as a factor in limiting the number of students coming over. I mean, I looked up a stat right before the program that prior to the pandemic, Chinese students accounted for 35% of all foreign-born students in the country, and since pre-COVID levels, it's decreased more than 50%, which seems, I mean, that is a drastic change.
Yeah, I think there has been an increase in other groups of students, especially from South Asia, but for sure the raw numbers of students has declined. I said there were 250, I don't know the exact numbers, 1,000 Chinese students. I think before the pandemic there were way over 300,000, if my memory serves me correct. But there's something of that magnitude. There's been a sharp decrease, and this is of course a bit of a problem for us also, because we do rely on foreign students, especially foreign grad students, to eventually, for people we hire for high tech, things like that. But to me, the bigger crisis though is our lack of understanding of China, because it's so much harder to understand a country like that, an authoritarian country like that, from afar. This is not a country like the United States where you can look up all kinds of things online. You can't look up, in the United States, it's amazing what you can find online about people, their home ownership and stuff like that. But in China, it's not a very transparent society, and we need to have more people. We need to have a push to get people to go back to China and study there, push undergraduates to go there. Academics need to take their students there, and there needs to be some sort of a program to encourage them to do that and to even subsidize the travel, because of course ticket prices are very high. I mean, there's a lot of problems like that are kind of banal, but they're actually important, if you're a 20-year-old. And I don't think these will ever go back to the way they were before. Part of the reason people don't go to China is also because of soft power. Like, China doesn't enthuse a lot of people to go. A lot of kids are much more interested in studying Korea because of K-pop, right? Or Japan because of manga, than they are China. China's a bit of a buzzkill. They're an authoritarian state, what's happening with the Uyghurs, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to still somehow get people to study it and to understand it better. It kind of surprises me that in the Cold War, we had programs to support Russian studies. After 9/11, we had programs to support Arabic studies, because no matter how you felt about those places, there was a national interest in understanding them. But we don't have a similar program today about China.
So to get back to the historians, we've got a question, a couple things on the underground historians. One is around the films. But let me just ask, is there a good resource beyond the Great Firewall to access the films and the documents that you mentioned?
Yes, and I'm going to put, I'm going to send to you, Tim, this website. You can put that out on the main thing. It's a website that I've started that will be going live later this month. It's called China Unofficial Archives, and it's I got a little bit of grant money from Open Society to do this, to put this together. It's a clearinghouse of 75 years worth of books, magazines, movies that challenge the CCP's monopoly on history. It's basically people who are supporting civil society. I have a little bit of some of the other names of the books and some of the movies at the end of my book of Sparks. There's a suggested readings section there, but this will provide free of charge online access to these publications and these movies. If you go there now to this URL, you'll just get a come back soon. I think it even says come back in August, because we thought we'd be a little further along by now. But we have over 1,000 items inputted, and once we do go, so you can bookmark it and come back at the end of the month, maybe around before Thanksgiving, and we should be live. And I can send you a note later. But that's one way.
A couple questions from the audience about Taiwan. So how are the underground journalists seeing the relationship between Communist China and the Republic of China?
Well, I think a lot of them are sympathetic to Taiwan. They see Taiwan as proof that Chinese society can be open and democratic. This is one of the tropes or lies that authoritarian leaders around the world say. They say, well, democracy may work in the West, but it won't work in our culture, whatever our culture is. It may be, say, in Iran, or maybe in Russia or something like that. And that's something that authoritarian leaders in Asia say. The leader of Singapore used to talk about Confucian values or Asian values. And the people, I think, in these underground historians, they look at Taiwan as a model of what Chinese society can be like, that it can be open and tolerant. It doesn't have to be inspired by Westminster democracy. It certainly doesn't have to be inspired by the US political system, which has its own share of problems, but it can be more open and more tolerant and still be within the bounds of Chinese tradition. That these overall ideas for how a political system can be organized are firmly within the idea of tolerance and respect for others' viewpoints and things like that one finds in the Chinese tradition as well.
So is there any possibility of the underground history movement gathering oral histories of the Cultural Revolution, sort of like Yad Vashem?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a big effort by that. Some of the people who I profile in my book are collecting oral histories before and they know that this stuff will never be shown probably in their lifetime in China. They're quite realistic about this. They're viewing this as messages in a bottle to future generations of Chinese people, that there were people in China, even in Xi Jinping's China, who were doing work like this. And some of this work is to get people on the record before they pass away who experienced the Mao era, or now even things like Tiananmen, which is also now 30 odd years in the past, and people are getting older and some people are dying, etc. So they're keeping records of this. And there's one fellow who we have 60 of his films on the website. His name he goes by this nickname called Tiger Temple. And he's done these interviews with people who throughout the 2000s were trying to push for civil society in China, famous law professors and activists, and many people were very prominent in the 2000s, and all of them have been shut down now under the Xi administration.
Well, that brings up an interesting thing. I mean, when I look at the anatomy of protest and activism in this country, we've seen a growing number of young people coming into it. So it makes me wonder, is there a strong intergenerational dialogue in China of younger people wanting to burrow into this history or use technology in ways that the previous generation didn't? And is there a conversation between them?
Yeah, I think there's more of a conversation, especially the past protests that I mentioned before, the white paper protest, for a lot of young people, the year from December, roughly, let's say December 2021 to December 2022 or January of this year was shocking. It was the first major crisis that they'd experienced. Many of them are too young to have experienced Tiananmen or even to have heard about it. They overall, the 90s, the 2000s, and the first part of the 2010s were some of the best years in recent Chinese history, a period when the economy was growing quickly, society was becoming more and more open, despite many road speed bumps in the road, but still things were getting better. And a lot of people thought that we were becoming more and more part of the world. We're going to be traveling more abroad. We're going to be having more contact with the outside world, have more foreigners are going to come here to live and to work, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, they found the country since the mid 2010s moving backward. And it all became extremely clear with the COVID policies, which started out rationally enough in 2020, 2021 as an effort to stop the virus from spreading, but then became just an instrument of control by the second half of 2021. Many people were intensely disappointed. And yeah, I do think they would use more technology. I mean, one thing that's really been striking to me, especially giving talks about my book over the past month, is the number of young people who come to my talks, young Chinese people, students who are active in some way, even though they are Chinese passport holders, Chinese nationals. They're still in direct touch with people back home. We saw in the white paper protests that Chinese people inside China were sending videos and evidence of the protests abroad to Twitter, to YouTube. It was being repackaged and circulated back into China. And so they were using Western social media as a kind of marshalling yard by using things like VPNs, which most people in China don't have, but a significant number of people do. And they form a kind of gatekeeper class that brings material inside and outside China.
So with this idea of, sort of total control, how do you explain that the CCP has not arrested or imprisoned this group of historians?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question that sort of one wonders, why aren't they all just arrested? Or one guy said to me once, why aren't they all just rounded up and shot? Well, I mean, I suppose in some level it could be all rounded up and shot, but there are a couple of reasons for that. I think there are costs to doing that. Some of the people involved in this are very prominent academics, very prominent figures in China, such as this filmmaker that I mentioned before. Arresting her for simply making films about problems in the 20th century would be extremely alienating to a lot of people in China. That would spread around China and cause a lot of trouble. I think also there's a manpower issue that one sometimes overlooks. We tend to think that China is a country with closed circuit television cameras everywhere, and there's some giant AI brain that's using facial software recognition software that's somehow figuring out where everybody is and what everybody's doing. That could be the case in 5 or 10 years, right? But right now, it's all done by people. This is also the case in the COVID lockdowns. You have to mobilize a lot of people. There's one guy I profile in my book who is now retired, living on the outskirts of the western Chinese city of Chengdu, runs a little cafe there, used to run an underground journal. He's now in his late 80s and doesn't do that anymore. But there are, by his reckoning, 6 to 8 public security bureau officers that he knows who are always following. They're always outside sitting, watching him. And, this is a huge burden on the state, especially on local governments, which actually have to fund this. It's not like there's some central public security bureau. It's not like one giant monolithic thing. It's basically like somebody in the center says, hey, there's what's his name on the outskirts of Chengdu. You need to follow him. And you have to put a shift on him 24 hours. Well, that means 8-hour shifts. It's easy to get up to 6 or 8 people, sick days, and people have to go back and write up reports. The local government has to do that, right? The local government has other priorities. They've got crime, they've got real crime, they've got other things, they've got youth unemployment, they've got problems to deal with, environmental issues or what have you, a natural disaster hits. It's a lot of money just to look after one guy like that. You got to have 6 or 8 people on him full time. So I think that it's hard to just, it's sort of like you can follow some of the people all the time and all of the people some of the time, but not like all the people all the time. And I think because there are so many thousands of people involved in this, it's just not physically possible for the government to do that yet. And I think if it does go down that path, you mentioned going to Eastern Europe. I was in Berlin when the Berlin Wall fell, and I have many contacts. I was in East Germany before it fell, and I know how the Stasi operated. And at one point, Stasi bankrupted East Germany because so many people worked for the Stasi. There was, I think, 1 in 14 people were informants. It was a huge operation that was like a cancer on the system. Similarly, you could find that this begins to hurt the state by the sheer money that's involved in monitoring these people.
So we have a question about what Americans can do or the international community can do to push back on the authoritarianism, but also to add to that question, what do we get right and wrong about China, and what do we need to understand about the long game with China's aspirations and ambition?
Well, what can we do? I think one thing, the conclusion of my book is a plea for more engagement with Chinese people, with some of these Chinese filmmakers, authors, etc. Not enough of their work is translated. In fact, not a lot of it is translated. Most of it isn't translated. It's still not translated. The films are not widely shown. I'm struck by the difference in how Eastern European intellectuals were treated in the Cold War. Among educated people in the West, Solzhenitsyn, Kundera, Havel, filmmakers like Milos Forman were relatively household names. But nowadays, their counterparts in China are not that well known. And so I think that's not just something the government can do, but civil society, our universities, our think tanks, our publishing houses should get more involved with these people and bring them over. Yes, there are language problems. Most of them don't speak English, but we have to figure out some way to support it. It's an incredible wind in someone's sails when they get asked to participate, when they get it doesn't even have to be going abroad on a fellowship, even just interest, their book being translated or something like that. When you're working on a project like this, how excited you become when somebody abroad is interested in what you're doing. So I think there's that. And that sort of relates to your question about what we get right and wrong about China. I think what we get right is the fact that China has changed. I think the China under Xi Jinping is not the China that we bargained for, that was the China, say, in the 90s and 2000s, that there has been a paradigm shift in how the party runs the country in its foreign relations, and we have to take steps to protect ourselves, basically. That's why I mentioned earlier, I am on board with things like the chip restrictions. I think Lenin famously said, or maybe this is just an apocryphal story, that capitalists will sell you the rope that you'll use to hang them. But we don't need to sell them the rope. If they're going to develop their own rope, then that's something we have to just accept. But we shouldn't be selling it to them. So I think that's right, that we have to protect ourselves. But we also have to understand that there are these other voices in China, and if we want to engage with China, the word engagement nowadays is kind of taboo. We shouldn't engage with China. It was all a folly trying to engage with China. But there are people in China we should engage with. It should be these kinds of people. They should become the kind of people we try to see, interlocutors when our politicians go over to Beijing or other cities. Even if they can't get in to see them, even if they're barred from seeing them, the fact that they are trying to see them is recognition that they matter and will help them.
So your book begins with a great quote from Hannah Arendt's Men in Dark Times about how even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination. So as you look at China, or I don't know, say Ukraine or Israel, Gaza, or even here in the US, are we seeing just a candle flickering in the darkness? And are you a hopeful pragmatist? Where do you stand when you're looking out at the world?
Yeah, that quote might be a strange quote to start a book on Chinese people in the 21st century, but it was cited by a Chinese journalist. She used it to start one of her essays on the families of human rights lawyers. And so when I see these kind of people who are still working, who are still pushing forward, I have to be optimistic in the human spirit that progress is possible, especially when people put aside, especially it's incumbent upon us in the most powerful country in the world to try to put aside our sometimes petty partisan battles, which are often so destructive, and not just for ourselves, but as an example to the rest of the world, and try to solve some of the problems, try to get on the right side of some of these debates abroad and support some of the people who are working, because I think there are amazing people doing stuff around the world. We have to look and try to support them rather than just say, oh, the world's a big bad place. I'm not going to send my kid overseas to study. I'm not going to go meet people overseas, or I'm not going to engage with the outside world, which I think is becoming sort of the mentality of a lot of people. Everything's too scary and dangerous. I'm going to hunker down here back home in my COVID home office and never get out in the world. We need to break out of that mentality. So that'd be my plea.
Well, I'm always reminded of Martin Buber's quote that all real living is in meeting when I hear what you're saying. Ian, thanks for the great conversation. The book is Sparks. It's hard to see with the blurring, but get it from your favorite independent bookstore. I'm so glad you could join us today. I want to thank the audience for your fantastic questions, and I'm handing it back to Derek Olson to take us out into our day.
Thank you all very much.
Ian, just want to second Tim and thank you for joining us here and for your partnership with the World Affairs Councils of America sister network. We look forward to seeing you in Washington, D.C. in the conference in a couple of weeks. Also, audience, want to remind you of our next upcoming program in person, posting in the chat, which is Navigating Next, Blueprints for 21st Century Diplomacy with Ambassador Joanne Powell. That's in person. Link to register. Again, it's free, but registration required is in the chat. And again, chance to see Tim moderating discussion this Friday in person for the Queer Documentary Film Festival here in Portland, a film called Transition about Afghanistan. Should be a fascinating film and discussion. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for supporting World Oregon. Ian, best wishes, and audience, stay safe, and we will see you at our next program.